Hello, ladies and gentlemen, my name is the Austrian, and I just wanted to post something very quickly that is somewhat controversial amongst a lot of libertarian and especially ANCAPs, because it's something that is viewed as not only controversial but sometimes completely useless, and that is voting. But what I'm talking about is not voting to actually undo state policy, because I think we're past voting actually being able to do that, but rather voting as a form of self-defense almost, so that one way or another, you know the state is going to be used against you whether you want it to or not, but rather you get to use the state for your own interests, so you're not just having it used against you constantly, and that you get less and less rights as the system progresses, so to speak. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today. Now, voting as a form of self-defense was first put forth by a gentleman named Lysander Spooner, who was an essayist and novelist in the 1800s. And it comes from his work of essays called No Treason, and the sixth part called The Constitution of No Authority. And he uses this line of reasoning to prove that voting does not necessarily give affirmative consent to the government in order that the governed approve of their actions. And so what he's saying is that, while yes, in order for the governed to have just rulers, they need to give consent to that ruler. However, he denies that voting is an adequate form of giving that consent. And he does so by stating some simple facts. One being that whether or not a man actually votes doesn't matter. He will still be governed regardless of the situation. And so if he is not voting, he's going to be governed and his rulers are going to rule over him regardless. And so voting cannot mean consent, because it doesn't really affect whether or not you're ruled. So rather than voting being a sign of giving consent to those rulers, Lysander Spooner puts forth this notion that man would vote in self-defense, and so that if some other man votes and some other rulers get elected in, it's their will being enacted through government force. But at least if that individual man votes and his side wins, it is now his will being enforced upon others. And so in this way, he is preserved more than, say, if he had not voted. Or at least he attempts to preserve himself better. And so this is a more logical conclusion to come to, rather than saying that his vote gave the government consent. It's more likely that he voted in self-defense instead. Now, I don't believe it would be incorrect to acknowledge that Lysander Spooner is very right in coming to this conclusion, that voting is pointless, especially if we're looking at it from the angle of the governed giving consent to the governors. It really cannot be justifiably viewed as such, and social contract theory permits such. One does not have to consent to the rule. One is simply born into a state of being in which being ruled is natural, and you are expected to surrender rights regardless of whether or not you consented to it. And so there's a bunch of other forms of consent that could be debunked in this video, but I'd like to focus more on the pragmatic applications of voting as a form of self-defense, because out of all the other forms of consent supposedly given to governments that social contract theory tries to justify, this one, and this refutation in particular of that supposed theory, gives us something to work with, as unfortunately, in order to defeat the social contract, you need to defeat all of its adherents, and being as that's just impossible, we have somewhat of a workaround here, a way to impose our own will and our own means of liberating ourselves somewhat through the state. Now, this is something undoubtedly that a lot of libertarians would have problem with, and with good reason, because the theory is that any form of power given to the state is going to be used against us. But to impose our will doesn't necessarily mean to give power to the state, especially through voting. As we know, there are occasions in which government does shrink. We can look at eras in the past, such as the Reagan administration, in which, yes, some military complexes did grow, but the large majority of the welfare state saw massive repeals. There was repeal in government oversight, and we're even seeing a little bit of that now in the Trump era. And so voting, while largely ineffective, is not completely so. And as such, we do have a tool at our disposal, and I think that it would be irresponsible of us not to use it. Now, this being the case where we can take advantage of state authority for once, how ought libertarians go about doing it is the bigger question, because obviously we don't want to see the state expanded more. We only want to see libertarian ideals realized. And as such, there are some obvious steps and some less obvious, possibly more controversial steps. One of those being, obviously, we vote for politicians who at least have some sort of surface allegiance to shrinking the state. And there are a lot of politicians like that, and it's up to each individual to try and see whether or not they're truly genuine about it. Because there are, of course, the Rand Pauls of the political game, the Justin Amishes, that kind of thing. And then there are the John McCains, who are, they say they're ostensibly right-wing, but of course John McCain is just a Democrat with an R next to his name. And so a lot of good voting for someone like him would do. And so you have to use your vote responsibly and make sure it works on all points. And this should be done for all levels, not just the federal level. Vote for town measures that mean smaller government. Vote for state legislatures who will do the same and not expand the state powers on the state level either. And so making sure of those basic things is very important. However, it goes beyond that as well. There's also a necessary part which will be more controversial but just as necessary, and that is the suppression of those who don't even believe in basic property rights. The physical removal of those people, in fact, I would argue. And I know physical removal is somewhat of a meme, but it needs to be stated that you can't have a conversation with people who aren't willing to even respect the most basic rules of debate, nor can you have a society with a group of people who are unwilling to acknowledge the most basic tenets of what helps human civilization flourish. And when I speak of these people, of course I mean the radical leftists who dominate much of left-wing political discourse nowadays, be it in the form of Antifa or even just other radical leftist groups such as Black Lives Matter. Much of the college scene at the moment is very leftist, and these are people who, one way or another, need to be dealt with, because they will continue to not only try to stop us at every point down the road, but they will continue to disrupt even through extra governmental measures, which makes them that much more of a problem, because not only are they going to try to play the game and negate everything we're doing, but they'll just ignore the game entirely and play by their own rules at some point when they realize they're not winning. And that is much more of an existential threat than any other thing a libertarian might face in trying to achieve a minimal state society or even an ANCAP society. Now, the reason this would be controversial is because obviously giving the state the power to remove political opponents would be very antithetical to libertarian belief, to say the least, because you're thinking it's a massive duty put in the state's hands simply because we disagree with these people. And of course the obvious come around is, well, what happens when we're on the short end of the stick next time? And the main goal would be, you won't be on the short side of the stick next time. And so there needs to be a certain effective use of state power to make sure that there won't be a next time. That the next time you hear of leftist ideology talked, it's only talked and laughed at in fucking college halls decades down the line from now. The goal is to make sure that another leftist never sees political power. And so, while this may seem an insurmountable task, I, of course, know of one example in which it's certainly been pretty successful. One mainly, but you could try to find a few others. And in that at least one, we have
of course, Augusto Pinochet's Chile, which has seen the re-election of some socialists in its time, but needless to say, they are socialist light to the point where they make some of the rhinos in Congress right now look like allies of Lenin, to say the least. And why? It's because he effectively managed state power. It's because he was effectively able to not only use it against his political opponents and those who would otherwise seek to destroy all proper societal discourse, but he effectively set the precedent that these people are the ones who are going to be worse for society. And that's something libertarians need to realize. If there's going to be a state propaganda machine, we might as well use it. If there's going to be a force that is going to impose ideological supremacy, we have to make sure it's our ideology being imposed. And we have to make sure that at the end of the day, either we've won all the arguments or there's no one else making the argument from the other side. And as horrible and totalitarian as I'm sure this sounds, I don't see any other reasonable way. If leftists aren't respecting the argument, how are conversations and debates just going to win? If you want to say that voting in general or voting in politicians isn't going to work, what is? Are we just going to all stop collectively paying our taxes? How are we going to win over enough people in that course of time to make it even effective? There is really, what I'm getting at here, no effective way of ending or even shrinking the state, so long as we allow people who completely disregard not only the discourse and the rules of the game, but who have complete contempt for it. And so it is up to not only libertarians and right-wingers in general, but those who wish to see the advancement and progression of civilization in any meaningful sense, to expel those who would seek its regression. And somewhat, I don't mean to bring up the paradox of tolerance, but it somewhat rings true in this sense that if you're going to tolerate people who blatantly disregard the game, then there really is no point in playing, because you'll know they are just ruining it for you in any case. And so I hope this minor rant and this minor rave is worth something to somebody out there, because I genuinely do see it as the only reasonable course of political action anybody who seeks true freedom has left. And it will get quite dark, I imagine, at some point, but it's always darkest before the dawn, or at least that's what they say. So hopefully this was meaningful to somebody. Hopefully somebody enjoyed. Hopefully all of you enjoyed who are currently listening. And thank you very much. Hope to see you again soon.